Every large collapse begins the same way, not with panic, not with chaos, not even with obvious failure. It begins with a sentence that sounds reasonable, familiar, comforting, a sentence institutions repeat when the system starts drifting away from reality. This time is different. That phrase does not announce collapse. It prevents people from noticing it. Throughout history, the most destructive breakdowns never arrived as shocks. They arrived as explanations. Calm ones, carefully phrased, designed to make abnormal conditions feel stable, even mature. In the late Roman Republic, rising debt and political centralization were not framed as warning signs. They were described as modernization, efficiency, necessary reforms for a growing empire. Each step felt rational. Each decision was justified by precedent. The system didn't feel fragile. It felt managed. This is the first pattern worth understanding. Collapse does not begin when systems fail. It begins when systems succeed for the wrong reasons. Credit expands not because productivity rises, but because trust is stretched. Bureaucracy grows not to solve problems, but to explain why problems aren't problems. Rules multiply, not to enforce discipline, but to preserve confidence. At every stage, the language remains calm. Historians often make the mistake of narrating collapse backward, highlighting the final crisis as if it were obvious all along. But to the people living inside these systems, nothing feels dramatic. There are no alarms, only adjustments. In 18th century France, state finances deteriorated slowly over decades. Each shortfall was treated as temporary. Each new tax was justified as minor. Each reform promised stability. By the time the system could no longer function, generations had already normalized dysfunction. This normalization is the lie. Not a lie in the sense of deliberate deception, but a structural one, a shared agreement to treat warning signals as features of progress. When institutions say stability has been engineered, what they often mean is that volatility has been postponed. When leaders speak of resilience, they usually mean that consequences have been redistributed. The dangerous part is not the claim itself. It's the repetition. Over time, the explanation becomes stronger than the evidence. Numbers stop being interpreted directly. They are filtered, contextualized, framed. A system no longer asks whether it's working, only whether confidence is being maintained. This is how trust shifts from reality to narrative. In Weimar Germany, early monetary expansion was defended as temporary flexibility. Inflation was not denied. It was explained away. Rising prices were framed as manageable side effects of recovery. The public didn't reject these explanations immediately. They accepted them because nothing appeared broken yet. That acceptance is always a turning point. Because once a society agrees that stability can be declared rather than demonstrated, every future imbalance becomes easier to justify. And importantly, this process never feels dishonest while it's happening. It feels responsible. It feels like expertise. It feels like adults managing complexity. This is why the early stages of collapse rarely produce resistance. They produce reassurance. And this is where the pattern truly begins. Once the language shifts, behavior follows. After society accepts that stability can be asserted through explanation, not results, incentives quietly realign. Institutions stop correcting imbalances and start managing perception. The goal is no longer to restore equilibrium, but to preserve confidence long enough for the system to keep functioning. This is not a sudden transformation. It happens gradually, almost politely. In imperial Spain during the 16th century, massive inflows of silver created the illusion of permanent wealth. Inflation rose, domestic production weakened, and fiscal discipline eroded. None of this was denied. It was contextualized. The empire was expanding. Trade was global. Traditional metrics no longer applied. Each justification sounded sophisticated. Each delay felt reasonable. The silver kept arriving, so the system appeared solvent. But solvency had become performative. Spending continued because confidence had not yet collapsed. And confidence persisted because the empire still looked powerful. This is the second recurring pattern. Visual strength masks structural weakness. As long as institutions appear large, complex, and authoritative, their internal fragility remains invisible. Scale becomes a substitute for health. Complexity becomes a substitute for resilience. Over time, the system grows harder to understand even for those managing it. Feedback loops weaken. Signals arrive late. Corrections become political instead of mechanical. In the final decades of the Ottoman Empire, administrative layers multiplied. New offices were created to oversee failing ones. Reforms were announced faster than they could be implemented. Each reform implied progress, even as capacity declined. What mattered was not whether reforms worked, but whether they reassured creditors, allies, and citizens. This is where the lie becomes embedded. The system tells itself that motion equals improvement. That activity equals control. That intervention equals stability. But intervention without resolution accumulates side effects. Debt grows, but it is framed as leverage. Currency weakens, but it is reframed as competitiveness. Institutional trust erodes, but it is replaced with procedural legitimacy. None of these reframings are false in isolation. They become dangerous only when they replace direct measurement of reality. Historically, this is the moment when societies lose the ability to distinguish between durability and momentum. Momentum feels reassuring because it implies direction. Durability requires patience, limits, and sometimes contraction, things that feel uncomfortable but preserve long-term stability. So systems choose momentum. In the decades before the Great Depression, financial markets expanded rapidly under the assumption that modern coordination had reduced risk. New instruments spread exposure. Credit flowed freely. Volatility seemed contained. Risk had not disappeared. It had simply moved. This relocation of risk is crucial. Systems rarely eliminate fragility. They displace it geographically, temporally, or institutionally. As long as the consequences remain abstract, confidence holds. And as long as confidence holds, the lie remains invisible, because nothing appears to be breaking. Everything appears to be working. That is what makes this phase so stable and so dangerous. As normalization deepens, time itself becomes distorted. Systems that rely on confidence rather than correction begin to borrow not just resources, but patience. Decisions are made with the assumption that future conditions will be more favorable, more flexible, more forgiving than present ones. This assumption is rarely stated outright. It is embedded in policy horizons, accounting methods, and institutional planning. In the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire, fiscal obligations were pushed forward through debasement and delayed collection. The state did not deny strain. It restructured time. Payments were postponed. Military compensation was altered. Obligations were redefined. None of this felt like collapse. It felt like administration. This is a third recurring pattern. When systems cannot resolve imbalance, they stretch duration. By extending timelines, institutions preserve the appearance of continuity. Problems are not solved, they are scheduled. Risk is not eliminated. It is amortized across generations. Over time, the future becomes a repository for unresolved decisions. Each extension feels small. Each delay appears manageable. But the cumulative effect is profound. Eventually, the present becomes hollow. In late Qing China, mounting fiscal pressures were addressed through temporary levies and provisional reforms that quietly became permanent. Emergency measures blended into standard governance. The state continued to function, but increasingly on borrowed credibility. Citizens adjusted. Markets adapted. Life went on. That is the critical detail. Collapse does not announce itself by interrupting daily routines. It embeds itself within them. People recalibrate expectations. Lower standards become normal. Reduced reliability becomes acceptable. At this stage, trust no longer depends on outcomes. It depends on continuity. As long as institutions remain visible and procedures remain familiar, confidence persists. This is why late-stage systems often appear stable for long periods. They are not stable because they are balanced. They are stable because they have trained participants to expect less. In the Soviet Union's final decades, chronic shortages did not immediately undermine legitimacy. They became part of everyday life. The system survived not by delivering abundance, but by normalizing scarcity. This normalization creates a paradox. The more a system relies on habituation to sustain trust, the less flexible it becomes. Any attempt at genuine reform risks exposing the accumulated distortions beneath the surface. So reform slows. Adjustment becomes cosmetic. Language becomes increasingly abstract. Words like efficiency, modernization, and resilience replace concrete measures of performance. Metrics multiply, but clarity declines. By the time contradictions become undeniable, they are no longer shocking. They are familiar, and familiarity dulls response. This is the phase where observers outside the system often sense fragility long before insiders do. Those inside have adapted too well. They have learned how to live within imbalance. And systems that teach adaptation over correction can persist far longer than expected, not because they are healthy, but because they feel normal. Eventually, continuity replaces credibility. At this stage, institutions no longer rely on trust derived from performance. They rely on familiarity. Procedures continue not because they work, but because they have always been there. This is the fourth recurring pattern. Ritual becomes a substitute for truth. In late medieval banking centers, financial houses that were effectively insolvent often remained operational for years. Ledgers were balanced through conventions. Losses were obscured by complexity. Confidence endured not because the institutions were sound, but because their collapse would have disrupted everything connected to them. The system protected the appearance of stability because acknowledging fragility felt more dangerous than sustaining illusion. This is not irrational. Systems are networks. When one node fails, others are affected, so institutions learn to delay recognition. They smooth over inconsistencies. They redefine success. Over time, signaling replaces substance. Audits become performative. Announcements replace outcomes. Accountability is redirected toward process compliance rather than results. In the final years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, imperial institutions continued to operate with impressive ceremonial precision, even as political cohesion dissolved. The machinery of governance functioned flawlessly. The legitimacy behind it did not. To those living within the system, this distinction was subtle. Trains ran. Offices opened. Documents were stamped. Nothing felt broken. This is why collapse so often surprises contemporaries. They confuse operational continuity with systemic health. By the time outcomes matter again, trust has already migrated away from reality. This migration has a consequence. Once confidence depends on ritual, the system becomes fragile to interruption rather than imbalance. A missed payment, a procedural delay, a symbolic failure, these matter more than underlying conditions. The system can absorb enormous stress, but it cannot tolerate disruption. This is why late-stage collapses are often triggered by events that seem minor in isolation. They are not causes. They are interruptions. The lie has already done its work. The belief that stability is inherent rather than maintained. The assumption that institutions persist because they deserve to, not because participants continue to believe in them. At this point, no single actor controls the outcome. Everyone behaves rationally within a structure that has lost flexibility. And crucially, no one feels responsible. Because nothing they are doing feels abnormal. Everything follows precedent. Everything is justified. Everything makes sense. Until it doesn't. When collapse finally becomes visible, very little actually changes. That is the part history tends to obscure. From inside, the end of a system rarely feels like an ending. Institutions do not vanish overnight. They persist in reduced form. Titles remain. Offices stay open. Language adapts. What changes is not structure, but belief. This is a final recurring pattern. Confidence does not break all at once. It thins. People begin to rely on systems less, without openly rejecting them. Participation becomes cautious. Commitments shorten. Trust fragments. In the later years of the British Empire, decline did not announce itself through collapse. It appeared as quiet retrenchment, strategic withdrawals framed as realignment, reduced ambition described as focus. The empire continued, just smaller. This shrinking phase is often mistaken for recovery. Stability seems to return because volatility decreases. But volatility falls when expectations fall with it. Lower promises are easier to keep. This is why late-stage systems often appear calm. They have already adjusted downward. By this point, the original lie is no longer spoken. No one needs to say that things are different this time. Everyone already knows they are. The belief has shifted from permanence to management, from progress to maintenance, from growth to control. And yet, daily life continues. People still work. Markets still open. Institutions still issue statements. From a historical distance, these moments are labeled collapse. From within, they feel like adaptation. That is why every generation believes its experience is unprecedented, not because it is, but because normalization always feels unique to those living through it. This is what makes systemic collapse so consistent across centuries. The sequence does not change. Only the vocabulary does. The lie is never dramatic. It is quiet. It sounds reasonable. And it works until it doesn't need any more. If this pattern feels familiar, it's because it has appeared in every complex society that mistook continuity for stability. And if this way of looking at history feels different from what you usually hear, that's intentional. This channel is about patterns, not predictions. About understanding how systems behave, not guessing what happens next. If you want to keep exploring how trust, institutions, and economies repeat the same structures across time, consider subscribing. Not because something dramatic is coming, but because none of this is new. And it only looks new when you're living inside it.